Welcome to the Contented Couples channel. I'm Annie Power. I'm a couple counsellor in London, UK. And on this channel, I talk to colleagues about what makes a couple work and how partners find each other, particularly with reference to attachment and with reference to the research I did for the book Contented Couples. And today I'm very glad to be talking to a Reuters journalist who happens to be my own cousin, which is very nice. And this is Emma Thomasson.
Hi, Anne.
Emma is a senior correspondent with Reuters in Berlin. Previously, she was a bureau chief in a couple of different European capitals. And the relevance here is that she's had quite a lot of experience of seeing couples under stress and what stress can do to a relationship. And she has a role at Reuters as she'll explain it better, but a kind of first aider for mental health. And as a manager, she's seen what stress can do. So I'm going to ask her about that, and she'll probably ask me about some of the couples in my research. Is that about right, Emma?
That's great. It's great to see you and hear about your book. Yeah, so I've worked for Reuters for a long time. I've moved around the world, obviously having a very busy job and children while working. Has definitely been a source of stress for me, and that's something that got me interested in the whole topic of mental health. And Reuters has set up something we call the peer network to support people. It was sort of had its roots in war correspondents coming back with PTSD, but then we realized that a lot of people actually, a lot of journalists were suffering from stress just from day-to-day things, not from being in a war zone or whatever, the sorts of stress that anybody can face in any job. And so this network of journalists who have support from professional counsellors has been something quite innovative that we've done at Reuters. I've been heavily involved in that and happy to be able to help my colleagues.
The thing that we're particularly interested in here is how that kind of stress and even actually PTSD, severe symptoms in one partner can impact on a relationship and then obviously on a family.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something through this work that we've done at Reuters, several of my colleagues have sort of come out about their mental health problems and have written about it, also to try and, destigmatize the whole topic. And several of my colleagues have written quite powerfully about the impact that's had on their relationships and the toll it's had on their relationships. I mean, I would say that, like I said, sort of moving around the world, having kids, all those sorts of things are also big factors in sort of adding stress to a relationship. All these things kind of pile one on top of the other.
From those accounts and the people you've worked with, would you say there's a theme for what can help a couple support each other at those times and pull through?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the reason we've had this network at Reuters is because, we believe in supporting people through talking about their issues and also being kind of more open if you have problems, and also more open in your direct relationships, but also with your employer, being kind of clear that no man is an island, and just sort of reaching out can be helpful. In terms of what helps couples in general, I think to be honest, and it's a bit kind of depressing to say so, but I think journalism and healthy relationships haven't necessarily gone hand in hand. I'm thinking about kind of war correspondents at the moment, obviously with Ukraine, and colleagues of mine kind of heading off to war zones, and many colleagues who were, in the Middle East in the last few years. I mean, people putting themselves in danger and being away from their families for long periods of time, and then maybe coming back with trauma. None of those things are generally beneficial for relationships, I would say. And but also, you know, as in my case, I mean, I haven't been a war correspondent, but I've worked under severe pressure for long periods of time, that kind of eventually led me to have a burnout. And obviously none of that is healthy for relationships.
There's the two really big areas I want to go back to there. The second one was what it's like to have a partner who goes off to join a war zone, and maybe even be a sort of star on the television, or that, you know, that in some cases. And I'm struck by how there's going to be parallels there to having a partner who possibly has an addiction, who keeps needing to go back to this dangerous thing, possibly having a partner who had this complete other focusedness, this other priority. It could feel like a partner with an infidelity. So that was the second bit, which is huge. And the first bit I feel is so important. You said the thing that probably helps and that you support people to do is openness, to have sort of less gap between what's going on inside and what's shared. And that does sound so important. And then thinking about what makes that more possible in a couple. And in the couples I interviewed for the book who are contented, they're self-diagnosed as contented couples. 4 of the 18 couples mentioned depression, but it had not derailed them. They cope with it. And I think one of the reasons they could cope with it is that the one who wasn't themselves depressed could feel empathy for the one who was, but they were not overwhelmed by it. And they didn't feel kind of blamed, like, oh, my partner's low, but that doesn't mean I've done something wrong. And that meant they could remain available rather than going into, what's the matter? What have I done? So this openness, which is so helpful, the thing that can often make it harder is the pattern that the couple are in, that one tries to share, but the other experiences it. They can't really hear the message, or perhaps the message doesn't come out very clearly. So the message might not come out, I'm feeling really low and uncertain about myself and how I'm coping in the world in quite a vulnerable way. It could come out as withdrawal, as silence, which can appear like a cold, stony silence. It can come out in a number of guises which don't really evoke empathy, which is obviously what would be more helpful.
I mean, I'm really interested in what you say about, and I guess this is kind of common language in your field, but the sort of pursuers and withdrawers, because that's something that I've only that sort of concept I've only recently come across, and I see it is a very common pattern in relationships that I see around me. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd be pleased to. So this is a concept that's particularly been developed by Susan Johnson and emotion focused couple therapy, which is what I mostly practice. And it starts with the observation about our attachment patterns, about whether we principally manage ourselves by approaching and trying to evoke care from the other, or whether we principally manage ourselves by going inside and keeping it all kind of stumm inside. Of course, the more wholesome thing is if we're in a secure kind of attachment where we're able to reach out for help when we need it, and at other times we can cope independently as well. And our reaching out very much depends on what sort of help is available. So we don't reach out if the person is a known unhelpful person. We reach out towards someone who's empathic and kind. That's a more secure response. But these two other responses are linked to, I'll name them because they're quite well known, the two less secure attachment strategies, which are avoidant and preoccupied. And it goes back to what kind of experiences we had as a child. But what happens in a couple is very often people fall into these roles. And the more the one person is, we've got to talk about this, I need to talk now, there's an urgency and a kind of insistence which can become intrusive, the more the other is, no, I'm going to go out for a walk now. Because this person who needs to go out for a walk, they regulate themselves by distance and patting everything down. And the person who's saying, we've got to talk now, they're trying to regulate themselves by getting access and a kind of urgent contact. And the very painful thing in a couple is that they can each, just in a very simple way, they each wind each other up. The very behavior that the other is using to soothe themselves is triggering the other into feeling worse. And the breakthrough for a couple, if they come to counseling, the breakthrough is when they can begin to say, we're doing that thing, when they can both begin to say that.
Yeah. And how many of the people you spoke to would kind of fall into that category, or the people you speak to more generally?
Well, those are definitely two different answers. So people who are coming to therapy, they very often have something about, sometimes you get two people who are pursuing, and then there's lots of conflict. Sometimes you get two people who are withdrawing, in which case they may not even come to therapy, they may just separate. But most people who come for counseling are having some kind of problem around their attachment strategies are abrasive with each other. In the research, because these were self-proclaimed contented couples, a lot, and they'd mostly been together decades, they'd actually come through to a place of really finding a way to live together in a good degree of harmony. But many of them recounted earlier phases where the pursuer-withdrawer cycle had been very bad. And some of those had gone to therapy to get help, and some had sort of muddled through without. So some actually used that language because they'd learnt it. A few couples had actually learnt that language, but many couples described the kind of rows, because I asked them all, what does a row look like? And most of them said, well, we don't have so many rows now, but we used to. And the way they were was, one is in the approach mode, and the other is in the let's cool it mode. And this could be so extreme that one could be standing there shouting and the other is just lying down with their eyes closed. It can get, very, very painful.
So that pattern is quite common then. But it isn't insoluble.
Both are true. I mean, it's so common. Anyone listening to this video will know, if it's not their own pattern in the couple, they'll have witnessed it in many. It's not insoluble. It does need the couple to find a way to pause and think and notice. And what then can happen is that instead of sharing their secondary feelings, which in the case of the pursuer might be an angry blame, like, why don't you ever talk to me? That sort of approach. And the withdrawer, an angry version might be just not even speaking, just walking out of the house, for example. Instead of sharing those angry versions, they're able to share the vulnerable version. And this is where it links back to think what you're saying about helping people believe they can share the vulnerability. So that, and this is what we do in couple therapy, is help people share the hurt which underlies that angry response. And when the vulnerable hurt is shared, we often get a much better response, well, almost always. And if we don't, then the relationship may not really be an attachment bond, because if someone we care about shares their vulnerability, we do respond well. It's just, unless the cycle is still going, you have to calm the cycle first.
The thing that I find as a mother, sort of thinking about all of this and just having children in general, is realizing how much the roots of our relationships are based in our own childhoods, and kind of thinking about what kind of childhood you're creating for the next generation. Sometimes I find that quite an overwhelming responsibility.
The really positive thing is that almost all parents really want to do at least as well for their own children. I think that probably the the painful thing is if people get diverted into thinking that doing well for their own children means sort of buying stuff and that kind of practical provision. Obviously, the steady, reliable home to live in, that's incredibly important. But the thing that will equip a child for life is having this emotional attunement and connection so that they can feel comfortable connecting to themselves and thus being intimate with another person.
Yeah.
So in this video, we've looked at the quite general questions of what pursuer-withdrawer pattern looks like in a couple. And Emma's going to have another conversation with me. So if you've enjoyed this, please do press the blue button and subscribe. And we're going to talk in the other video about the impact of stress on a couple. Thank you so much, Emma.
That was great. Thanks.